Well, joining Sue Lawley, who's sitting in for Wogan tonight, will be Sheila Hancock, Shirley MacLaine, Barbara Waller, and there's music from the Chieftains. So that's Sue Lawley, alias Wogan, tonight at 7 o'clock. And now on BBC One with news of the South East, here's Jane Markham.
Good afternoon. We're joined by viewers who would normally be part of the BBC South region. Their transmitter has been affected by the worst storm since records began. 11 people are feared dead after winds of more than 95 miles an hour swept the southeast of England during the night. One of the worst hit areas was Kent, where 7 people are thought to have died. They include 2 seamen who are missing after their ship sank outside Dover Harbour. Dover Harbour is closed for the first time in living memory. In Essex, no one is believed to have been killed, but the town of Clacton is virtually cut off and the army is helping to clear the roads. There are water shortages in Braintree, Colchester and Sudbury because of damaged mains. And there's been chaos in the City of London this morning. Trading on the stock market is now underway. Share dealing was suspended earlier today because of the gales. And justice has ground to a halt at the Old Bailey. Its famous dome is in danger of falling down after scaffolding collapsed on top of it. Court cases have been cancelled as a result. Train services in the southeast have virtually ground to a halt. There are hardly any services anywhere on southern and eastern regions. A few intercity trains are operating from King's Cross. Euston and Paddington lines are infrequent. On the tubes, the Northern and Victoria lines offer the best service. The Jubilee and the Central are running some trains. The Piccadilly, Bakerloo and District lines also offer a limited service. But the Circle and Docklands Light Railway aren't running. And for the latest update on conditions on the roads in the region, we're going over to the AA and Nick Simmons is on the line.
Good afternoon. Well, most of the main routes now are beginning to clear up. We're seeing the debris removed. Still plenty of side roads, though, in London badly affected by debris and fallen trees. Essex, Kent, Surrey, Sussex and Hampshire, they're the worst affected counties. In Essex, still very strong crosswinds affecting the M25 and the M11. And in Kent, the east of the county, the Medway towns and Canterbury are the worst affected areas. M23 in Sussex is closed near Crawley, and there are delays on the A24 in Surrey between Leatherhead and Dorking. Traffic there is at a standstill because of debris across the road surface. M3 affected in Hampshire. The best advice really still remains, if you don't have to make your journey, you'd be much better off staying at home.
And that's it. We'll be back with more South East news just before 4 on BBC One. Michael Fish with the weather.
Good afternoon to you. Well, the good news is that the worst of the strong winds is over now. It's blown itself away into the North Sea. It's still going to be pretty breezy this afternoon, but dying down all the time. Some brightness, some sunshine, some blustery showers, though, coming through from time to time. Still on the breezy side tonight, but just fine and dry. And a quieter spell of weather tomorrow, I think, hopefully allowing most of us to do some clearing up. Probably fairly dry tomorrow, lighter winds, a reasonable amount of sunshine, but the weather pattern does remain very unsettled. That's all for now.
In half an hour, a surprise visitor turns up in Ramsay Street as we join those Australian neighbours. And that's here on BBC One.
The 1 o'clock news from the BBC with Michael Burke.
Good afternoon. The worst storms for hundreds of years hit the south of England early this morning, killing a dozen people and bringing the whole southeast to a halt. Gales of over 100 miles an hour smashed buildings and caused millions of pounds worth of damage. Dozens of main roads have been blocked and a whole regional rail service cancelled. There was no warning. The weathermen were caught with their forecasts down. The Home Secretary has called a crisis meeting of ministers. And today's other main story, the Iranians hit a tanker and challenged the United States. The worst storms for centuries have swept across southern England, killing at least 12 people and paralysing a quarter of the country. They came without warning in the early hours of the morning, winds that hit 110 miles an hour and then went off the gauge. The storms have done millions of pounds worth of damage, blacked out cities and towns, blocked hundreds of roads, wiped out a whole region's train services and brought chaos to Heathrow and Gatwick airports. Ships have capsized and run aground, buildings collapsed, and millions of people were prevented from getting to work. The Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, has called a crisis meeting of government ministers this afternoon. The gales are heading north now, but dying down. They developed to hurricane strength over the Bay of Biscay before sweeping over southern England from the southwest. At Hastings, a hotel collapsed like a pack of cards, according to firemen, trapping guests in the rubble. In Windsor, a woman was killed by a falling chimney. At Banbury, a man died when his car was blown into the path of a lorry. And at Highcliffe in Dorset, 2 firemen were killed and 4 of them injured when a tree fell on their engine. The south was the worst hit, and our first report is from Bruce Parker in Southampton.
Only now is the full damage caused by the ferocious storm becoming apparent, with virtually nowhere in the south of England remaining unscathed. All along the south coast, houses and blocks of flats have had their roofs torn away. It's a scale of devastation not experienced since the Second World War. Several people have been rescued by firemen, with buildings in danger of collapse.
We had 2 people knocked on our door at 2 in the morning. We let them in and they were very frightened. And then about 3:30, the kitchen window went. And then about 15 minutes later, the roof caved in. And my husband was trapped in the chair and so was I. But the other 2 people left. But my husband's disabled and can't walk. So it took me nearly half an hour to get him onto the floor and drag him along to the bedroom at the end, which was still in one piece.
And where is he now?
He's just been taken to New Haven Hospital, I understand.
2 firemen were killed in Dorset when a tree fell on their fire engine. These Sussex policemen escaped unhurt when a tree fell on their patrol car. The centre of Brighton this morning was unrecognisable. Coast Guards on the Isle of Wight say they recorded winds of more than 110 miles an hour during last night's storm. The wind speeds then went higher even than their instruments could record. There's been widespread damage on the island, with the famous Shanklin Pier washed away completely. Power lines have been brought down. Thousands of homes are without electricity. The lack of power to transmitters has also meant that a large part of the south of England has no television pictures, either from the BBC or ITV. Scores of roads are still blocked by fallen trees, rail services virtually non-existent in the southern region. There's flooding too in many areas, adding to the distress of thousands of people in the south of England.
In London and the southeast, it's thought at least 7 people have died in the gales. Many areas are without electricity and road, rail and air links are disrupted. British Rail's southern region is at a standstill, so is eastern region south of Peterborough, and there are no Midland region trains south of Rugby.
The hurricane-force winds which lashed London in the early hours of the morning were the strongest ever recorded in the capital. Hundreds of trees were blown down in the city centre and the suburbs. One man and his dogs had a narrow escape when a tree crashed down in his car near Hyde Park. The West End also took a battering. Some department stores had their shop fronts blown out. Scaffolding collapsed on cars in Belgravia, but luckily no one was hurt. The only person who died in London during the storm was a tramp who was sleeping rough near Lincoln's Inn. The fire brigade were inundated with a record number of emergency calls. A spokesman said they had not been alerted by the weather centre until just before the storm struck, and they were overwhelmed by requests for help. By dawn, the full scope of the damage was clear. Many roads were blocked by fallen trees. With rail links cut and tube and bus services curtailed, the police warned people to stay at home unless their journeys were really necessary. Some drivers managed to find a way through the obstacles. Many got stuck in huge traffic jams on the motorways into London and the M25 ring road. Council workmen are now busy trying to clear main roads as quickly as possible, but it will probably be several days before all roads are clear. In North London, firemen rescued a woman after a chimney collapsed and fell through every floor of a 3-storey building. She was taken to hospital but wasn't seriously hurt. The headquarters of the London Ambulance Service was blacked out for a time during the night by a power failure. But by early this morning, every ambulance in London was on the road dealing with routine and 999 calls. Small airfields around London were badly hit by the storm. Light aircraft worth around £10,000 each were torn from their moorings and blown onto their backs. The weathermen say that the storm has now moved away from the capital. The wind's heading north, but diminishing in force.
On the east coast, hundreds of people have been evacuated amid fears of flooding, and people living near Felixstowe harbour have been moved from their homes after a tanker carrying toxic chemicals hit a jetty and started to break up. It's feared there could be an explosion. In Harwich, the ferry used to house Tamil detainees broke free from its moorings. They're now stranded on a mud bank.
Gusts of up to 100 miles an hour across the eastern counties closed hundreds of roads. The driver of this lorry was taken to hospital after a tree crashed onto his cab. Another driver died in an accident in the Gales at King's Lynn. On the railways, nothing moved. It's likely to be at least 48 hours before services are back to normal. Power and phone lines are down. Engineers face a long struggle to restore supplies to remote villages. On the main roads, motorists weave their way around fallen trees, while some towns and villages remain cut off completely. The emergency services have been coping throughout the night and morning with thousands of calls for help. The long list of incidents growing longer by the minute, callers being urged to be patient. The official advice from the police, even in the main towns and cities, was for people to stay at home. Most schools remain closed for the day. Parents were told that it was considered too dangerous for children to venture out. Those that did venture out had to battle with the elements. It's hoped the storms will blow themselves out this afternoon so the big clear-up can begin.
Many homes in southern England are still without electricity this morning after power lines were brought down in heavy winds. A short time ago, the Central Electricity Generating Board said it had restored supplies to the national grid, but that area boards still faced a long uphill battle to get electricity to consumers. Parts of London are still without power, and the worst hit areas outside the capital are Essex, Surrey and Kent.
Staff at the CEGB's National Control Centre in London got their first inkling of trouble around 4 a.m. when power supplies on the south coast were disrupted. Within minutes, Dungeness power station was out of service, then the cross-channel link from France. Power stations and lines began going down like ninepins. By 4:30, 90% of the southeast supply had to be shut down to stop the problem spreading to other parts of the country.
In this situation, which was extremely rare indeed, we lost more generation than we normally plan to lose, and therefore we had no alternative than to take prompt action to cut consumers off.
Have you ever known a situation like it?
I've never known a situation as bad as this before.
At 9 o'clock, the Energy Secretary arrived to hear how staff were coping with the emergency from the board chairman, Lord Marshall.
Well, obviously, they're coping with a very difficult situation. They've lost a tremendous amount of the transmission. Basically, the power stations are waiting to produce power, but the lines to take it to the customer have been damaged by the winds. They are, in fact, the highest winds ever recorded in London since records were kept. And so we don't know at the moment whether lines are down or whether they've just clashed, in which case they would automatically cut out. Helicopters are now up, but there are thousands of miles of cable to look at. But that works in hand. It's being treated as a matter of the utmost importance and highest emergency.
And from the chairman himself, a grim warning on the dangers to the public.
I would urge the public that if they see cable or any kind of wire on the ground, do not go near it. Don't touch it, don't go near it. It's possible it could be live, and if they touch it, it'll kill them.
It took 6 hours before all power stations were back on stream, but the difficulties are far from over. The problem now is not with the CEGB, it's with the individual area electricity boards who have the responsibility of getting power to the customer. Given the widespread damage to power lines, some are predicting that particularly in rural areas, restoring supplies to every home could be a matter of days rather than hours.
Even as the repairs and the mopping up get underway, people are asking, why weren't we warned? Didn't the weathermen know there was such a fierce storm on its way? Well, they did know, but they didn't think it would affect Britain. Here's Bill Giles with last night's closed-down weather summary.
Well, that's what the situation was like earlier on this evening. It's associated with this quite deep low pressure area, and a few days ago we thought it would be coming a little bit further west, bringing the strong winds right across the country. But now it looks as though most of those strong winds will stay away, although it's still going to be very breezy up through the Channel and on the eastern side of the country.
Because the weathermen had discounted the storm, they weren't able to warn the emergency services. The London Fire Brigade said the first they knew was a warning at 3 o'clock of winds of 40 miles an hour, possibly gusting higher. The ambulance service said they had no warning at all. What went wrong?
It took the country by surprise. The question is, why? At the headquarters of the Met Office at Bracknell in Berkshire, weathermen had seen something was brewing as long ago as last Sunday. But then there was no indication of just what was in store. By noon on Wednesday, the depression in mid-Atlantic seemed innocuous enough. By 6 p.m. it had moved east, warm air from the Azores being forced upwards, creating the depression beneath it. By 6 o'clock yesterday morning, 2 separate centres had formed and the depression had started to deepen as it entered the Bay of Biscay. By noon yesterday, the 2 centres began to merge, making it more intense. By 6 o'clock last night, the storm had gathered strength, forming itself into a spinning top of turbulence. By midnight, the storm centre was west of the Channel Islands. The depression suddenly deepened, whipping up some of the fiercest winds Britain has seen. Wind speeds averaging 75 miles an hour are hurricane force. That happens in America, where gusts reach 140 miles an hour and more. In London, there were gusts of 94 miles an hour. The average winds being storm force. At the London Weather Centre, the blue gauge registered the 94-mile-an-hour gust on the roof. Another wind gauge on the British Telecom tower was blown away. The readings just gave up. Experts today said it's not the Met Office's fault. They didn't foresee it earlier. This type of depression is notoriously difficult to forecast accurately. The weather in the upper atmosphere can be monitored with so-called upper air stations, weather balloons. Britain has 8 of these stations, not sufficient to forecast what happened last night. It was such a rare event that equipping the Met men to monitor it accurately would simply be too expensive.
Well, joining me now from the London Weather Centre is the BBC's weather forecaster, Ian McCaskill. Well, Ian, you chaps were a fat lot of good last night.
Well, we have been forecasting high winds and gales relentlessly since Sunday. I admit, we weren't forecasting hurricane force winds, and that's what we got, and that's what we will get maybe once every 50 years, maybe once a lifetime. We haven't worked out the figures just yet.
Well, yes, but your weather forecast at midnight last night talks about a rather windy, showery airflow, blustering bursts of showery rain. No kidding. I mean, if you can't forecast the worst storms for several centuries 3 hours before they happen, what are you doing?
Well, we did forecast it rather more than 3 hours before it happened. Unfortunately, that was around midnight, a bit late to tell people. We told everybody we could think of.
Well, I was talking to the ambulance centre this morning, and they didn't get any warning at all.
We didn't tell the ambulance people. They didn't ask us to.
Well, yes, all right. But how bad was it, Ian, in relation to what's gone on in the past? I mean, was this really a sort of record-breaking storm?
The oldest people around here, and that's me, can't remember anything like it at all. We're starting to look in history books. We'll find a storm that looks like it in 1703. Now, there have been other stormy periods since then, Michael, but very little stronger than that, and not in the London area. We are quite confident that this is the strongest thing we can find for many, many years in London.
Well, are you weathermen just shrugging your shoulders as a result of all this, or is there an inquest going on down there at the Weather Centre?
Well, there is at this very minute, and there will be for the next several months. We are getting better and better. This one, just stronger than we thought.
Ian McCaskill, thanks very much. Oh, just very quickly, what's it going to be looking like? I mean, is this petering out, or are other people going to get it?
Yes, no, it's moving north. There are still gales in Lincolnshire and in Norfolk as well, but they are gradually moderating, and these winds will not return tonight. They will not return over the weekend.
Ian McCaskill, thanks very much indeed. Well, listening to all that is Peter Bottomley, who's the Minister for Roads, I suppose we can call you. Why are we unable to cope with severe weather in this country?
It's not coping with severe weather. It's having trees which have stood for 80 to 120 years, all coming down at the same time. I don't think anyone could predict that. Naturally, if we wanted to say this should never happen, we'd have no tree within 100 yards of a road or a railway line.
But, I mean, at least a quarter of the country has been paralysed by this storm. I mean, surely something could have been done to cope with this and the other weather crises that come our way seemingly every winter.
Well, obviously, if we were a Scandinavian country that was covered with snow and ice for 3 months of the year, we'd all have snow tyres, not that actually we were faced with snow on this particular occasion. I think that we do need to realise it is an exceptional occurrence. Some of the cut-off communication was the electricity generating system protecting itself, and it's better to lose it for a few hours and then have it back than to try to keep it running and then ruin the power stations and ruin the grid for weeks.
I was talking to the emergency services in the early hours of this morning. Is there not a case for having more coordination between those services? I mean, the ambulance men were telling me they were sending 3 ambulances to every accident in the hope that one of them would get through. Well, surely the police ought to be helping them do that. Wouldn't that be less wasteful in these emergencies?
I think we'd be crazy if we didn't learn from each event like this, and I suspect that more petrol chainsaws will help. Obviously, getting through on the roads is important. We won't be able to restore the railway lines instantly, except, of course, we cleared a lot of trees away with the storms last night. I think that there are lessons to be learned. Perhaps coordination at local level can be improved, and that's where the emergency services know that they can call on the help of the armed services and, if necessary, come to national government if they need extra help.
You were actually calling on people this morning to stay at home. What's your general advice, briefly now?
If people don't need to travel, it's better that they stay at home because there are still weak trees around, and it's trees which are causing the major problem. There are weakened buildings in some areas, and the emergency services need to be able to get through without the normal Friday evening traffic jams. Obviously, if you're part of the emergency services, you're needed, and people have responded enormously well. Key message, perhaps, for the future, when these things happen, we ought only to use the 999 services for life and death emergencies, and not just to report every fallen tree.
Peter Bottomley, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're not the only ones to be suffering from the weather. Our neighbours in Europe have also felt the full force of high winds and lashing rain. The storms have affected an area extending from Portugal to northern France. Gales hit the coast around Portugal's second city, Oporto, flooding nearby towns and villages, closing harbours and cutting railway lines. In northern France, the province of Normandy experienced similar weather to ours, while in Paris, winds brought a heavy crane crashing to the ground, causing traffic chaos in the rush hour.